Before the light, there was darkness. Before redemption, there was the fall. And in the forbidden pages that never reached the hands of the faithful lies, the truth about the first son of blood, the one who bears the weight of the eternal mark. Welcome to a journey through the shadows of sacred history that few have dared to explore. The lost gospel of Cain, contained within the enigmatic Book of Nod, represents one of the most controversial and jealously guarded texts in the hidden history of humankind. Today, we will unveil the secrets of manuscripts that, according to many occult scholars, were deliberately suppressed from canonical scriptures for containing disturbing truths about our origin and destiny. If you follow through to the end of this revelation, you will discover not only the true nature of Cain's curse, but also how this ancient condemnation echoes through the centuries, silently shaping the history of humanity and potentially your own fate. Prepare yourself to question everything you thought you knew about the origins of mankind and the true nature of evil. The Book of Nod represents one of the darkest and most controversial texts in occult literature, whose existence has been debated for centuries among esoteric scholars and alternative religious historians. Unlike the known apocryphal texts, this manuscript not only complements the canonical scriptures, but offers a radically different narrative about the events that followed creation. Its oldest fragments, discovered in underground chambers in northern Mesopotamia, bear inscriptions in pre-Babylonian languages that challenge even the most advanced contemporary methods of translation. The manuscript's history is shrouded in mystery as dense as its content. It is believed that the original text was compiled by secret followers of Cain over millennia, preserving his teachings orally before finally recording them on clay tablets, scrolls, and later, codices. Each generation of guardians added their own revelations and interpretations, transforming the Book of Nod into a palimpsest of forbidden wisdom that spans across eras. The earliest historical records of its existence date back to the Sumerian period, where enigmatic references to a text of the immortal exile appear in cuneiform inscriptions. The successive translations and recreations of the Book of Nod reflect its fluid and adaptable nature, a characteristic of esoteric texts that survive in the shadows of official history. During the medieval period, accounts from Benedictine monks mention fragments of a heretical text that tells of the journey of the first murderer after his divine condemnation, clearly a reference to the manuscript. These fragments are said to have circulated among European secret societies, subtly influencing currents of Gnostic and alchemical thought. The Catholic Church, recognizing the danger posed by these alternative scriptures, ordered their systematic destruction during the Inquisition. However, the survival of the Book of Nod into modern times suggests the existence of an unbroken lineage of guardians devoted to preserving this forbidden knowledge. The most complete version known today was allegedly recovered from the catacombs of Paris in the late 19th century, though there are reports of other fragments discovered in locations as distinct as Tibetan monasteries and forgotten Egyptian tombs. What makes this text particularly disturbing to traditional religious authorities is its ability to fill deliberately left gaps in the canonical scriptures, offering answers to questions that were never meant to be asked about the nature of divinity, of evil, and of human destiny. The canonical scriptures tell us only a fragment of Cain's story, man consumed by jealousy who killed his brother and was condemned to wander the earth with a divine mark. However, the Book of Nod reveals an infinitely more complex and disturbing narrative about the first son of Adam and Eve. According to these forbidden writings, Cain was not merely a jealous farmer, but a being endowed with extraordinary spiritual sensitivity, capable of perceiving realities hidden from common sight. His offering of fruits to the deity represented a conscious rejection of blood sacrifice, a first human attempt to transcend primordial violence. The murder of Abel, far from being a simple act of envy as narrated in Genesis, is described in the Book of Nod as a ritual sacrifice with profound cosmic implications. The oldest fragments suggest that Cain had witnessed angelic entities communicating with his brother, promising him power in exchange for continual blood sacrifices. The fratricide would thus have been a desperate attempt to interrupt a pact that Cain believed threatened all of humanity. And seeing the corruption seeping into creation through the blood that was shed, Cain raised the stone not against his brother, but against the pact he had forged with the Watchers, recounts one of the most controversial passages of the manuscript. The curse subsequently cast upon Cain takes on radically different contours in the Book of Nod's narrative. Instead of a mere punishment, the condemnation to immortality and eternal wandering is presented as a transcendental transformation, the first great spiritual metamorphosis in human history. And thus, he who tasted the blood of his own blood transcended the bounds of mortality, becoming neither man nor God, but a third being the first to walk between worlds, declares the text. The mark of Cain was not merely a sign of protection against vengeance, but a seal of primordial power that connected him directly to the generative forces of the universe. Cain's years of exile in the land of Nod, only briefly mentioned in the Bible, occupy entire chapters in the forbidden manuscript. These passages detail his journey east of Eden, where he is said to have encountered pre-Adamic civilizations inhabited by beings not descended from his parents. Among these peoples, Cain established himself as a priest king, sharing forbidden knowledge about agriculture, astronomy, and mystical arts. And the peoples of the outer land bowed before the one who bore the mark of divinity, for they recognized in him the power that transcended the human condition. The text recounts, suggesting that Cain was venerated as a divine entity by the first peoples of Mesopotamia, planting the seeds for the future fertility and death cults that permeated the ancient civilizations. The Book of Nod details the moment of Cain's curse with a richness of symbolism and metaphysical depth absent from traditional scriptures. According to the manuscript, when the Creator confronted Cain after the fratricide, it was not merely a judgment, but a cosmic encounter between primordial forces that would permanently alter the fabric of reality. And the voice that spoke came not only from above, but from within the very earth, soaked with the blood of the righteous. For the act had torn the veil between worlds, describes a particularly evocative passage. This transcendental encounter is said to have occurred simultaneously across multiple planes of existence, establishing a precedent for all future divine interventions in human history. Cain's physical and spiritual transformation is described in terms that suggest a primordial vampiric metamorphosis. The text narrates how the blood in his veins turned black as the abyss, his skin pale as the full moon, and his eyes absorbed the essence of eternal darkness. This transformation, far from being merely a punishment, is presented as a forced evolution, the creation of the first post-human being, neither mortal nor immortal, but existing in a liminal state that transcended the established categories of creation. The manuscript suggests that this metamorphosis was accompanied by a dramatic expansion of Cain's consciousness, allowing him to perceive dimensions of reality previously veiled to ordinary human senses. The 7 seals of the curse, mentioned only indirectly in canonical scriptures, are elaborated upon in disturbing detail in the Book of Nod. Each seal represented a perverted gift that simultaneously bestowed power and imposed limitation. Immortality, accompanied by an eternal hunger for vital blood, superhuman strength, coupled with vulnerability to the light that once symbolized divinity, heightened perception of spiritual realms combined with alienation from the natural communion with the Creator. And thus it was sealed 7 times with contradictory signs, so that he would eternally bear both the mark of grace and of condemnation, declares the text, establishing the paradigm of the vampiric condition as an existence defined by contradiction and spiritual paradox. Particularly fascinating is the account of Cain's wandering after his transformation. The Book of Nod recounts that he spent 7 times 7 years in absolute isolation in the depths of a cave in the mountains beyond Nod, where he contemplated his new nature and gradually mastered the powers and limitations of his altered condition. During this period of self-discovery, Cain is said to have developed the first mystical disciplines that would later define the vampiric lineage abilities to manipulate shadows, communicate with the dead, and influence the minds of mortals. In the darkness that was now his natural domain, he discovered that the limitations imposed by the curse contained the seeds of unimaginable power, states an enigmatic passage that grounds vampiric mythology in a narrative of spiritually perverted yet potent transcendence. After centuries of contemplative isolation, the Book of Nod recounts that Cain eventually returned to the world of men, finding a humanity that had grown considerably. Primitive cities had blossomed across the fertile plains, and with them, the first empires emerged under the rule of priest-kings. It was in this setting of nascent civilization that Cain, driven by unbearable loneliness and a desire to create companions who shared his transcendental condition, performed the first act of vampiric transformation. And he drank the blood of chosen mortals, then returned to them his own transformed essence, thus creating reflections of his own divided nature. The manuscript describes. The selection of the first vampires was not random, according to the forbidden scriptures. Cain specifically sought individuals whose perception already transcended the ordinary limits of human consciousness: seers, shamans, prophets, and mystics who had glimpsed realities beyond the material veil. These first converts, known in the text as the Three Ancients, are given names that vary significantly across different translations of the manuscript, but they are consistently described as embodiments of fundamental archetypes: the warrior, the sage, and the shaper. Each of them embodied an aspect of Cain himself, yet also introduced new qualities into the forming vampiric lineage. The ceremony of transformation is detailed in ritual terms that suggest a deliberate inversion of humanity's earliest religious rites. Performed during a total lunar eclipse, the vampiric initiation involved the ritual opening of 7 bodily gateways, the introduction of the cursed blood into a sacred vessel made from the clay of Eden, and the recitation of incantations said to reverse the natural flow of vital energy. And just as the Creator breathed life into the nostrils of the first man, Cain breathed death, life into the lips of the chosen, transforming them into vessels for an essence that did not entirely belong to this world. Recounts a passage that establishes vampirism as a mirrored and distorted creation of the original divine act. The manuscript describes in disturbing detail the agony of vampiric transformation and the subsequent awakening of the first converts. The process is likened to a death followed by an inverted rebirth, in which the initiate simultaneously experiences the dissolution of mortal consciousness and the expansion of perception to encompass realities previously inaccessible. And when they opened their eyes to their second existence, they saw not only the visible world, but also the invisible currents that sustain it, not only matter, but also the spirit that animates it. The text states, "This dual perception, a fundamental trait of the vampiric condition as described in the Book of Nod, established vampires as bridge beings between the material world and spiritual dimensions, normally inaccessible to mortals, granting them an ambiguous status as being simultaneously cursed and blessed." According to the Book of Nod, after creating the Three Ancients, Cain established the first vampiric community in the mythical city of Enoch, name that deliberately echoes the city founded by the biblical Cain, yet imbued with supernatural characteristics absent from canonical accounts. Located in a deep valley surrounded by impassable mountains, Enoch was built as a dark mirror of the earliest human cities, with architecture that deliberately defied natural laws. Its pillars rose like accusing fingers against the sky that had rejected them, and its foundations penetrated so deeply into the earth that they touched the chambers where the primordial giants sleep. describes a particularly vivid passage of the manuscript. The vampiric society of Enoch developed with a strict hierarchy based on genealogical proximity to Cain, establishing the paradigm for future vampiric lineages. The three ancients formed the innermost circle around the founder, each eventually creating their own progeny, who in turn generated their own vampiric bloodlines. The manuscript details how this social structure mirrored, in reverse, the tribal organization of the earliest human peoples, replacing familial blood ties with vampiric blood bonds. And just as the children of men recognize their fathers through flesh, the children of night recognize their creators through the black blood that flows in their unliving veins. The text explains, establishing the foundation for the complex clan system that would characterize vampiric society through the millennia. Particularly disturbing are the descriptions of the rituals practiced in Enoch, which combined elements of primitive human religious practices with macabre innovations made possible by the supernatural nature of vampires. Blood ceremonies held in subterranean temples involved elaborate human sacrifices, in which the ritual draining of blood was accompanied by incantations said to capture not only the victim's vital force, but also fragments of their soul. And through the sacred drink, they not only sustained their unnatural existence, but also preserved memories, talents, and essences of those who offered their blood to the immortals, the manuscript recounts, suggesting that vampiric feeding transcended mere physical necessity to become a perverse sacrament of spiritual communion. Cain's rule over Enoch extended for centuries, during which the vampiric population steadily grew, though under strict procreation rules established by the founder himself. The manuscript indicates that Cain had received prophetic visions, revealing that unchecked expansion of the vampiric race would threaten not only humanity, but the very existence of the vampires themselves. And he saw that if the blood of the curse were to spread like floodwaters, it would draw the wrath not only of the Creator, but also of the elder forces that dwell in the depths of the cosmos, warns an enigmatic passage. This concern with the ecological and metaphysical balance between vampires and humans laid the foundation for many of the traditions that would later regulate the creation of new vampires, including the necessity of permission from elders and periods of trial for neophytes. The apex of the vampiric civilization of Enoch was followed by a catastrophic downfall, detailed in some of the most enigmatic and fragmented passages of the Book of Nod. According to the manuscript, after approximately 1,000 years of existence, vampiric society began to show signs of moral and spiritual degeneration, with the more distant descendants of Cain gradually losing their connection to the original purpose of their founder. Vampires of later generations, increasingly diluted from Cain's original blood, developed new perversions and excesses, treating humans not as a sacred source of sustenance, but as mere livestock to be exploited and tortured for entertainment. And thus, those who were furthest from the primordial source forgot that they too had once been human, and in their forgetting, they planted the seeds of their own destruction. The text laments. The manuscript suggests that Cain initially attempted to correct the course of his decadent society through new laws and severe punishments for transgressors. He established the ritual of blood binding to reinforce hierarchical obedience and instituted the concept of forced torpor as punishment for those who violated the most sacred traditions. However, these measures only exacerbated internal divisions, leading to the formation of rival factions among the descendants of the three ancients, each interpreting Cain's intentions differently. And those who had been united by the blood of night found themselves divided by the poisons of pride, ambition, and envy, same sins that had followed humanity since its expulsion from the primordial garden. Observes a particularly lucid passage on the cyclical nature of corruption. The final destruction of Enoch is attributed to a combination of natural and supernatural forces, which the Book of Nod describes in apocalyptic terms. A great flood, possibly the same referenced in biblical traditions, was merely the physical catalyst for a catastrophe of metaphysical proportions. The manuscript recounts that the waters that covered the earth were but the visible reflections of the celestial waters of judgment, which flowed not only over the bodies of men but also over the souls of those who had transcended natural death. Particularly notable is the suggestion that this destruction was not accidental, but deliberately orchestrated by Cain, who, horrified by the corruption of his creation, sought to purify his lineage through an inverted baptism of destruction and rebirth. The survivors of the cataclysm, predominantly members of the generations closest to Cain, dispersed to the four corners of the known world, carrying with them fragments of Enoch's wisdom and traditions. This vampiric diaspora laid the foundation for the future bloodlines that would arise in different human civilizations, each adapting the original teachings to the local cultures they parasitized. And just as the children of Adam were scattered and diversified after the fall of the tower that defied the heavens, so too were the children of Cain scattered after the fall of the city that defied the natural order. The text compares, drawing a deliberate parallel between the vampiric dispersion and the biblical episode of Babel. The manuscript suggests that Cain, after orchestrating the destruction, vanished from the active history of his progeny, entering a deep state of hibernation in a secret place, from where he would silently observe the development of his lineage across the millennia to come. After the dispersal of the original vampiric society, the Book of Nod presents a fascinating account of how the different bloodlines evolved and adapted to the various human cultures they encountered. The descendants of the three ancients gradually developed distinctive traits, both physical and metaphysical, that reflected their new environments and the human societies with which they interacted. Those who sought refuge in the frozen lands of the north developed skin even paler, glowing beneath the moonlight, while those who dwelled in the warm lands of the south acquired the ability to move through shadows with supernatural fluidity. The manuscript describes, laying the groundwork for the diversification of vampire clans that would characterize later ages. The text details how each major bloodline established its own traditions, rituals, and codes of conduct, often incorporating elements of local human religions, but subverting them for their own purposes. Particularly notable is the account of how vampires infiltrated the mystery cults of the ancient world, from the temples of Isis in Egypt to the Dionysian rites of Greece, using these religious structures as facades for their own hierarchies and as sources of ritualized sustenance. And those whom mortals worshipped as manifestations of divinity were often the eldest among the children of night, who had learned to transmute their isolation into veneration. The text observes with dark irony, suggesting that many of the chthonic deities of antiquity were in fact ancient vampires worshipped by unaware humans. The evolution of supernatural abilities specific to each lineage is described in terms that blend mysticism with a strange proto-biology. The manuscript suggests that the eldest vampires discovered they could consciously shape the traits of their progeny through specific rituals performed during the transformation process. And just as the potter shapes the clay before it hardens, so too did the blood creators learn to mold the essence of their children during transformation. Emphasizing certain aspects of the curse while suppressing others, the text explains, this process of deliberate differentiation would have resulted in the gradual crystallization of specific traits that eventually defined the great vampiric clans, each manifesting a particular aspect of Cain's original curse. Fascinating are the passages detailing how certain lineages established symbiotic relationships with specific human groups over generations, creating complex parasitic dynamics that benefited both species. The manuscript describes vampires who protected entire tribes from external threats in exchange for regular sacrifices, others who served as unofficial advisors to royal dynasties, and some who established secret cults within established religious institutions. And just as the oak and the mistletoe exist in union where one draws life from the other while offering gifts in return, so too did the wisest among the children of night learn to cultivate human communities rather than simply prey upon them, the text observes, suggesting a supernatural ecology where the most adapted vampires were those who formed sustainable relationships with their human food sources, preserving them rather than destroying them through unchecked exploitation. The final sections of the Book of Nod transcend historical narrative and enter the realm of apocalyptic prophecy, detailing disturbing visions concerning the ultimate fate of the vampiric lineage. According to the manuscript, Cain did not vanish permanently after the fall of Enoch, but instead entered a state of deep hibernation, from which he will eventually awaken to judge his descendants. When the last star alters its course, and the moon is stained permanently red, the one who bears the first mark shall return to reap what he has sown through the ages, proclaims one of the most oft-quoted passages of the prophecies. This cataclysmic event, referred to in the text as Gehenna, deliberately echoing the sacrificial valley mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures, would mark the end of the vampiric cycle, and potentially of humanity itself. The manuscript outlines specific signs that will precede Cain's awakening, forming an apocalyptic calendar that many occult scholars have attempted to correlate with real-world historical events. Among these omens are the time when mortals shall create light without fire, the age when blood shall be crafted by men in vessels of glass, and the century when death shall be temporarily defeated by the artifices of mortal science. Particularly unsettling is the prophecy that Cain's return will be preceded by a time when the youngest among the children of night shall rise against the elders, devouring the blood that made them, suggesting an internal revolution within vampiric society as a prelude to the final judgment. The descriptions of Gehenna itself are fragmentary and highly symbolic, resisting literal interpretation. The manuscript suggests that Cain's awakening will trigger a fundamental transformation in the very nature of reality, during which the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds will temporarily dissolve. And on that final day, the veil that separates the visible from the invisible shall be torn like rotted cloth, allowing the primordial forces that uphold creation to manifest directly in the world of men, prophesies the text. This collapse of dimensional barriers would result in supernatural phenomena on a global scale, including the awakening of ancient entities, slumbering in subterranean chambers, and the return of angelic beings who have not visited Earth since the primordial flood. The ultimate fate of the vampires during this apocalypse is described in ambiguous terms that suggest both destruction and transcendence. According to the manuscript's most enigmatic prophecies, Cain will divide his progeny into those worthy of redemption and those condemned to final dissolution. The former are said to undergo a second transformation that transcends their vampiric condition, elevating them to an entirely new existential state, neither mortal nor immortal, but something beyond both. The latter will face the true death from which there is no awakening, the complete dissolution that not even immortal blood can resist. The manuscript concludes with the disturbing suggestion that this judgment will not be limited to vampires alone, but will also encompass all of humanity. For in the blood of every child of Eve lingers a distant echo of the first curse, a dormant seed of transformation that shall bloom when the firstborn returns to claim his inheritance. Thus, the final prophecy of the Book of Nod implies that the fates of vampires and humanity remain inextricably entwined, bound by the primordial blood that flows, in varying concentrations, through the veins of all the descendants of Adam.